Welcome to Limits Exhausted, Texas's personal injury litigation podcast.
Hey everyone, welcome in to an all-new episode of Limits Exhausted, Texas Injury Litigation Podcast with attorney Kiernan McAlpine, the founder of McAlpine Law Firm and a board-certified specialist in personal injury trial law by the Texas Board of Legal Specialization. I'm your host, Mike Leon. Kiernan has served as lead counsel in more than 40 trials and is trusted by attorneys all across Texas and beyond, handling complex, high-stake injury cases involving 18-wheelers, catastrophic injuries, and wrongful death. Today's episode, we're going to be talking about the unfortunate traumatic brain injuries that happen. Kiernan is going to explain why these invisible injuries are often misunderstood, they're missed, or undervalued, and how they affect the course of serious litigation. Kiernan, it's good to see you. And since this is our first episode, before we actually dive into anything, can you kind of tell us a little bit about your background, what drew you to trial work, and how you developed a focus on these severe injuries like TBIs that we're going to be discussing today?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Mike. Like you said, my name is Kiernan McAlpine, and I am originally from Houston, Texas. I went to Beller High School in Houston, and I went to University of Texas School of Law. I've been a lawyer for 16 years. I've been trying cases for about that long. I've tried, like you said, over 40 cases as a first chair, meaning doing jury selection, opening statement, closing argument. And I've handled thousands of personal injury cases in Texas. I'm licensed in some other states as well: Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, Alabama, Georgia. And my focus and my practice is dedicated to trial work. I'm a trial attorney, and litigation is what I'm into. As far as how I got into trial work, I like it. It's competitive, it's decisive, and it's fun. And when you go to court, you get a result. Although it's true that maybe 95% of cases settle, the fact is that you can always get more money from a jury than a defendant or their insurance company would ever be willing to pay you to settle a case. So trial is really your shot at the full compensation verdict that clients deserve. And additionally, another thing is that, insurance companies and corporations know who's trying cases. So you might think, well, 95% of cases settle. That means that cases are going to settle, right? Well, that's true. But what cases settle for is based on the amount of risk that the insurance company is specifically putting on that case at trial. And the more you try cases, and I have a reputation for trying cases and winning cases, even big cases, they know who's trying cases, and it makes their risk go up, and it makes cases worth more money, and it makes them more valuable. So as far as why I specifically got into serious injury cases and have my focus on things like traumatic brain injuries, I'll be blunt about it. The more serious the injuries, the harder that the defense is going to fight back. And the more of an actual fight the litigation is, and the more of a contest it is. And that gets me going. And additionally, I get an edge from knowing a lot more about the medicine than the average personal injury lawyer. While I'm not a doctor and I'll never understand the medicine in a case the same way or as well as a doctor does, I've taken a lot of time over the years preparing for expert depositions and examinations of experts at trial, learning a lot of basic stuff about the medicine that's involved in the cases that I handle. And I'm pretty familiar with the current literature and peer-reviewed journals and statistics about these cases. So I'm able to have a more intelligent conversation with experts. I'm able to call them out when they make obvious mistakes, and I'm able to go toe-to-toe with them a little bit better than otherwise. So learning more about the medicine involved in the cases is something that's made a really big difference in my practice.
Well, let's get into that, because I mentioned at the beginning that this is going to be about traumatic brain injuries. So kind of what makes that fundamentally different from other injuries when it comes to especially your area of expertise, which is proving the case?
Yeah, definitely. So traumatic brain injuries are very, very different from any other kind of injury that you're going to have in a personal injury case. Now, they're somewhat similar to, let's say, a spine injury in a limited sense, where with the spine injury, more often than not, you don't see any external visible evidence of a spine injury on a person's body. It's an internal injury. Their ligaments have been torn, their discs have been herniated, their joints have been inflamed, these types of things. You can't see it with the naked eye. And that's true for traumatic brain injuries as well. But one of the biggest differences between traumatic brain injuries and something like a spine injury or an extremities injury is that they typically don't show up on imaging tests. And one of the major myths, and I'm going to go through as we talk about this today, some of the major myths about traumatic brain injuries that people have that, I want to dispel. One of those myths is that a traumatic brain injury should show up on an X-ray or on an MRI, magnetic resonance imaging test. So imaging studies typically will not show any evidence of a traumatic brain injury. Now, if somebody has like a broken skull where there's penetration into their brain, or they have a brain bleed, subdural hematoma, hemorrhaging, things like that, those things can show up on a CT scan or an MRI, but 90% of concussions or more do not show up on an MRI, and they do not show up on an X-ray. The X-ray is just going to show whether somebody has broken bones. Typically, it shows the condition of the bones. The MRIs get into the soft tissue, but unless somebody has a brain bleed of some kind, it's not going to show up on an MRI. So the vast majority of the time, not only do you not have the ability to see the injury from the outside with the naked eye, you also can't see it with most imaging technology like CTs, X-rays, and MRIs, which makes a really big difference in these cases, because MRIs just aren't good at looking at functional cognitive impairment, diffuse axonal injury, and the other things that can actually cause a TBI. So that's one of the major differences, is that you kind of start out with an injury that isn't visible to the naked eye, and you can't establish through the more conventional sources of imaging most of the time.
So, Kiernan, can you kind of walk us through then a moment from a past case, maybe even a recent case? Signs of the TBI were a little subtle at first, but then they kind of became a little bit more crucial as the litigation started to move forward?
Yeah, absolutely, Mike. That's actually the normal case. One of the myths about traumatic brain injury is that in order to have a traumatic brain injury, you have to have loss of consciousness. And another major myth associated with traumatic brain injury is that you should expect to see the psychological symptoms like memory impairment, loss of memory, amnesia, forgetting where things are, losing track of the sentence, mid-sentence, things like that, as well as executive dysfunction, not knowing how to focus or control your emotions or understand what order you need to do tasks in. Those types of things typically show up much later on in a case for a couple of reasons that I'll discuss in a little bit. But in terms of a recent case where we had a client who was sitting in her car with her head against the left windshield when she gets struck laterally, and she strikes her head against the side of the vehicle, and not a very severe impact, but because of the way that her body was positioned inside of the vehicle, her head actually came into contact with the inside window, and she didn't have loss of consciousness. She had a normal X-ray at the hospital. She didn't even do a brain MRI at the hospital because they weren't suspecting anything. And all that she had were some headaches, but the headaches were worsening. And after a while, she and members of her family started to notice some of these symptoms that we commonly associate with TBIs. We started to hear stories about her having forgetfulness like she wouldn't have had, or she started stammering when she was speaking. She started losing track of what she was doing mid-task. And these things were not characteristic for her, and they started to develop months and months after the case got started. So it's actually very common. In fact, it's more common for somebody with a traumatic brain injury not to have really glaring symptoms on day one, and for the injury to progress over time.
Can we move over to the insurance carrier part of this? Because I'm interested on that front. You mentioned them at the onset. Why are the TBIs so frequently minimized or disputed by them? And what kind of arguments have you seen them repeatedly make on the defensive side?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I mean, that's something that I'm very well versed in, and I'm happy to talk about it as much length as you want me to. So why are they minimized? Well, first of all, it's the insurance company's job and it's the defense's job to try to minimize injuries, to try to protect their own bottom line, and to pay out as little on cases as they can justify. And it's, if they didn't do that, then I wouldn't have a job. But the fact is that that's what they do. And one of the things that's, having tried so many cases for plaintiffs in Texas and elsewhere, is just that we see a lot of the same arguments. With liability, it can often be very messy. There's a lot of different facts all over the place. Different cases tend to be different. But with injuries, we tend to see a lot of the same things. And what we see with traumatic brain injuries is not that different from what we see when it comes to other injuries. To the extent that they can dispute it, they will. So one of the things that makes traumatic brain injury different from the way it gets defended and the way that the insurance companies tend to minimize it is just that, because, like what I said earlier, it's much more common that traumatic brain injuries don't show up on x-rays, they don't show up on CT scans, they don't show up on MRIs. So what ends up happening, and there's a guy named Rick Friedman from the Pacific Northwest, who's a very well-respected trial attorney who's written a whole book on this called Polarizing the Case, where what the defense does is they try to flatten the case to essentially entirely about whether or not the plaintiff should be believed, and they'll attempt to portray the plaintiff using Friedman's words as a liar, a cheat, and a fraud. So essentially, one of the myths, again, that I think is associated with traumatic brain injury cases is that it's a completely subjective injury where the case will stand or fall on whether the jury believes what the plaintiff is saying about their symptoms. So what my practice does is we can make significant inroads into supporting these cases with a lot more than just the plaintiff's own words as far as what their symptoms are and how they've been affected. So there are neuropsychologists, right? It's a specialty of psychology where they study cognitive impairment and cognitive deficit, and they can start to correlate things that are that the person is having difficulty with through a series of testing. It usually takes about 2 days to do the full panel examination, and they can provide peer-reviewed objective testing that shows cognitive impairment. So we can start to establish it that way. There's a cutting-edge technology also called diffusion tensor imaging, MRIs, where essentially, in layman's terms, what they look for is the flow of water through canals in the brain, called tractography. And the DTI MRI is an up-and-coming technology that is capable of showing some of those cognitive deficits that a neuropsychologist could assess. And so these are a couple of the tools that we use to try to show that it's not just a completely subjective injury. It isn't all about whether the plaintiff is telling the truth, and the situation anymore where the defense can just leverage the optics of a person in court suing for money. Should you believe them? Could they be biased, et cetera? No, we can ground the traumatic brain injury in multiple methods of objective medical science that can show some of the things that we need to prove. Yeah. And those things make a huge difference. But possibly the biggest difference in these cases is witnesses from friends and family, coworkers, people who care about the plaintiff, but who don't have a dog in the hunt, so to speak, in terms of the outcome of the lawsuit. Lay witness testimony about, the person's before and after, changes in personality, changes in function. That testimony is often extremely compelling. And so we look to add that to cases as much as we can.
Kiernan, let me quickly piggyback on that. So when a referring attorney sends you a case, it's involving a brain injury, I know you said you know a lot more about the medical stuff than the average bear, let's say, for lack of a better term. But what are some of the first indicators that you look at that tell you that the case is going to need one of those experts that you just mentioned?
Sure. Well, I mean, one of the things that I think can happen is that brain injuries can actually slip through the cracks of cases. I think it's actually easy for these cases to go a little bit unnoticed. And like I said earlier, it's a myth that you will lose consciousness. In fact, 90 to 95% of the time with a concussion, you will not lose consciousness. If you have a severe TBI involving, a skull fracture and a subdural hematoma, and you have a hole in your head, basically, then it's a lot more likely. It's not definitively likely. It's not 100%, but it's a lot more likely that you will lose consciousness if you have like a very, very severe TBI. But for concussions and moderate TBIs, it's much more likely than it is unlikely that you will not lose consciousness. So I think that since that's one of the red flags for a TBI, loss of consciousness, when there isn't loss of consciousness, a lot of the time it gets overlooked. And, the most common symptom that we see is headaches, but headaches can have a lot of other explanations. So generally we look for worsening headaches and also other things that are the physical manifestations of the traumatic brain injury are sensitivity to light, sensitivity to sounds, as well as fatigue and dizziness. So if any of those things are present, and you might have to scan through the medical records to look for them, or talk to the client in a lot of detail about these things in order to even know that they're there. But the symptoms are actually very subtle at the beginning, and they can often get overlooked. So that's one of the first things that we want to do is we want to make sure that we've looked in every case for these injuries, because they can often slip through the cracks. Like doctors treat the patient in front of them. At the ER, they're trying to confirm that you're not going to die. They might get you some medication. They might send you to a different doctor for a referral, but they're not trying to do a deep dive on everything about your condition. So if something isn't screaming at them, they might not find it. And a lot of doctors, like, physical therapists, chiropractics, extremities, MDs, internists, they're not really trained to find these things. So it's not uncommon for these things to go overlooked. And unfortunately, when they do go overlooked, it's something that the defense will typically try to use to cast some credibility and doubt onto the case.
Yeah, for sure. Kiernan, as we put a bow on today's episode, for maybe the attorney or somebody that's out there listening to this, they don't never heard of traumatic brain injury cases. They don't handle the lawyer side. They don't handle TBI litigation. Expand a little bit more on the overlooked, misunderstood. What other aspects of the case are most likely to be overlooked and misunderstood during their referral part or even the early development stage part?
Right. So definitely. So the first thing would simply be just that it's possible that if you're not accustomed to working on a lot of traumatic brain injury cases, that you're going to have clients with traumatic brain injuries and you're not going to even know about it. And, when that happens, it's obviously doing a really enormous disservice to the client. And it's also potentially, harming the recovery that you're hoping to get from the case. So it's very important to have somebody that's like well-versed in TBI to look at these cases and assess whether or not that's something that's there. Additionally, another thing is that we have to look for cases that, have longer tails of development for the symptoms. So just because somebody does not have amnesia, loss of consciousness, or executive dysfunction immediately doesn't mean that it won't develop with time. So we need to be checking in with the client on a regular basis, checking in with family members, people that know them, once some time has passed from the injury event, because they're probably going to be the person who notices before the person does themselves. Like they say, fish don't know that they're swimming in water, things like that. Well, once your, post-injury baseline adjusts to, the new, status quo of having a brain injury, then it can be hard for the person that's experiencing those things to really know that something has changed. But people that know them well from the outside might pick up on it a lot faster. So that's another thing that's really important about TBI, is just that there's a limitation in some cases on the plaintiff's own ability to even know what's changed. And that's something that somebody that knows them well would have to be able to tell us about. So that's another thing that we want to investigate if we're suspecting for a TBI. We also need to make sure that the cases go to the right kind of doctors, basically to identify the TBI and then to assess how bad it is and to start to quantify it. So, generally speaking, the most qualified doctors to assess whether a traumatic brain injury happened or not would be a neurologist or a neurosurgeon. But then once they've been diagnosed with a TBI by a neurologist or a neurosurgeon, then we want to get them to a doctor that can start to tell us sort of the extent of it. How bad is it? What are the impairments? What are the limitations? That's something that a neuropsychologist can do. And a doctor, like a neurosurgeon that's capable of reading the DTI MRIs that I was talking about earlier, they can start to tell us sort of objectively where in the brain these things are coming from. So, we want to have the case be worked up in the right way.
Right. Well, Kiernan, thank you for the time, the insights. I appreciate it as always, my friend.
Thank you very much, Mike. Have a good one.
And that's it for today's episode of Limits Exhausted, Texas Injury Litigation Podcast. If you want to learn more about Kiernan, the work that his law firm is doing, do me a favor right now. Visit McAlpinelaw.com, McAlpine law.com. Thank you to everyone out there for listening, but don't forget to like, subscribe, leave a review and comment, or share the episode with someone who needs to hear it. As always, I'm Mike Leon. We'll see everybody next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.